Hello, everyone. This is Rob Lord, and I wanted to introduce you all to Who's Who in the Zoo for Heritage Architects. And today we're going to be talking to Roger Todd. I don't want to steal Rebecca's thunder. Rebecca, can you introduce us to Roger?
Yes, of course. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Who's Who in the Zoo this week. We have with us Roger Todd, a heritage architect based in sunny Sunshine Coast, and he has been in private practice since around about 1984, which is when he first registered as an architect. And what makes him all the most special is that he's an advocate for sustainable design and planning. And he also believes that good architecture can uplift the spirit as well as deliver comfortable and functional internal environments, which I think I personally agree with wholeheartedly. So, we would love to know, Roger, in your words, a little bit about your background, what got you started in this field and this industry. You have a few decades of experience, and there's a lot that's been the driving force behind you being in it all of this time. So, would you like to sort of lead us into it?
Okay, well, I was brought up in Brisbane, out on the western suburbs. Actually, lived in a Queenslander out at Moggill, and I did university at the University of Queensland, their architecture school. And Queensland's pretty unique in that it has developed its own vernacular architecture, and that was a response to the available materials and the conditions in early Queensland, particularly maybe starting in Brisbane. And I think there was always a lot of thought around that in the architectural profession. Um, I've always been interested in heritage. I did my thesis on the early history of Spring Hill, which is probably one of Brisbane's first suburbs, and it's quite unique in many ways. For instance, a lot of cities have high class and low class suburbs, but Spring Hill, everything happened in the same place. The rich people lived on the ridges, and the poor people lived down in the valleys, where they literally got all the sewage and the like leaking down. But it was also a very steep suburb, and the available material in Queensland was timber. There were huge resources, and the development of the Queenslander started to solve a lot of the building problems. One particularly, I think, was termites. They do more damage than floods and fires combined. So, to utilise the available timbers, they ended up with termite-resistant stumps and then a tin ant cap, which didn't actually stop termites, but it made them visible as they built their mud tunnels up and around the ant caps. But nobody really knows exactly why buildings were built on stumps. There are many different theories, but there were many reasons, even down to mosquitoes. That different species of mosquitoes stay within a set distance from the ground. So if you were
Oh, yeah.
living 6 feet above the ground, you might eliminate an entire species of mosquito. But other things, the ease of building on steep sites, and you ended up with storage space under the house. It allowed breeze all around the house. So Queenslanders were built for the summer heat. They probably weren't so good in the winter, but that wasn't the problem. It was the heat in summer. Corrugated iron had a big history in Britain, and a roofing material that could be transported large distances. So brick construction just wasn't a sensible material to use in Queensland because it soaked in heat and emitted it at night when you really needed things to cool down quickly.
Hmm.
So yes, I'm diverging a bit there. Queensland does have Australia's only vernacular architecture, and it's a big influence. Um, I
So
moved
Roger,
to
a
the
couple. Sorry, you talk.
When I moved to the Sunshine Coast, I moved to a little suburb called Moffat Beach, just to the north of Caloundra. And of course, there were no Queenslanders here. The whole suburb really developed in the post World War II time period, and we had quite a different type of architecture here. We had beach houses, which were quite different from permanent places of residence. Um, There was no need for prestige. You could leave your marble columns back in Brisbane. At the beach was somewhere to get out of the rain at night. But there were a real mix of construction. Some were removal houses, some were owner built, and there were little architectural gems as well. And they utilised the new materials available post-war, um, plastics, asbestos cement, which obviously doesn't apply too
Yeah.
well today, but it was the wonder material of the time.
Mm.
We had brightly coloured paints, first time in the history of the planet, where you could paint your house any colour you wanted to. And we also had the influence of Art Nouveau and Art Deco. Um, so some of these places were really quite stylish, but they weren't appreciated by most of the population. They were just thought of as fibro shacks, and people would come from Melbourne and say, "Oh, we'll just demolish this shack while we think about what we're going to do on this site." And that hit a nerve with me because they really were quite special, and that was one of the things that I pursued during my career here at in Caloundra. I got involved
So
in
I did have
the
a couple of questions.
local branch of. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, Roger, I cut you off a bit there. I wanted to really delve into your journey. So you went up to, did you go up to Moffat Beach straight after graduating, or was that sort of 10 or 20 years down the track?
No, I did a few years working in Brisbane for architects there, and we always had a plan to move to the Sunshine Coast. And it actually happened sooner than I expected. I was in Caloundra actually looking for work and got a job in a local architectural practice here. So it all happened pretty quickly back in the early
And has
80s.
and has it always been heritage? You said you did your thesis on heritage. I know how much investment that takes to do your thesis in that manner. Did the jobs that you had in Brisbane and then later on in Caloundra, were they in the field of heritage architecture or were they just in architecture?
Just in architecture in general, not
Right.
heritage related at all. In
And did
fact,
you
the
become like
whole
the heritage expert? Like, did you become
I
the firms?
Not in those firms. Really in moving to Caloundra and getting involved in the National Trust was certainly a big part of my interest
Thing?
in heritage. And then looking at the places close to home that were important and perhaps weren't being looked after. Moffat Beach was an example that um, that particular heritage was undervalued and not understood. It wasn't on any of the on the radar of the heritage organisations, and also um, during my career, heritage has been addressed at a government level where perhaps it wasn't before. The National Trust, for instance, the only way they could conserve places was to buy them. But then with the advent of the Queensland Heritage Act, there was a responsibility for owners of heritage places to look after them. And that was the first time that had happened. And we saw some pretty bad things happen in Brisbane. The Bellevue Hotel perhaps was one of the reasons that the Queensland Heritage Act came into being. Um, I
So I
lived
think
in Brisbane.
what you're talking about there, Roger, is that tension between, say, commercial developments and of course the desire to preserve our heritage. What happened in the Bellevue Hotel? You mentioned that. Um, was that a tug of war over exactly that commercial value versus the need to preserve things?
It was, and the heritage side lost out. That the place was demolished in the dead of night. They didn't even turn the power off when they demolished it, and that was back
Right.
in the Bjelke Peterson days. And I think that was one of the reasons behind the Queensland Heritage Act, that people felt a sense of loss. It's that thing, you don't know how important it is until you lose it.
Mm,
And we
mm.
saw a lot of
Roger,
developments in Brisbane that really um, disregarded the heritage significance of places, and it wasn't legislated. But with the Queensland Heritage Act, there was a push to identify places and put more of the onus of conserving them on the owners, with
so
assistance from the state government.
that's a nice segue. I did want to kind of just launch a question at you. You know why heritage matters, but you've already begun to answer why heritage matters. Um, Brisbane's tale with the Bellevue Hotel, though, I think that was a tale that was reflected in other cities as well. Is that correct? Are there some memorable or noticeable stories about this type of tension in other cities in Australia?
I guess so, but probably not an expert in what's been happening in other places.
Okay.
Queensland, I know, is different. Our buildings, the timber buildings, were um, not as perhaps robust as some of the stone and brick buildings you might get in the southern areas. And one of the solutions for heritage is just to put the building on the back of a truck and take it somewhere else. But not a very good solution. And
Yeah.
the various heritage lists talk about places, not buildings. So you're always talking about places, and the place is really important. Think of the little church on the hill. For a start, it's on the hill, but it's got the yew trees, it's got the graveyard, it's got all those other things about it that relate to its place, why it was built there and not somewhere else. And if you put it on a truck and move it somewhere else, its value drops away considerably. The National Trust had a great story to illustrate the importance of heritage, and it's about a smaller scale, your own house. If you go home tonight and find where your house was is a pile of ashes and it's burnt down, assuming you're insured, what are your greatest losses? And it's not your washing machine or your TV or your latest computer. It's your family photos and memorabilia. It's the swimming certificate you got when you were 12 years old. It's the table given to you by your grandmother. And they're worth nothing in monetary value, but to you, they're really important. They're part of who you are. And if you expand that to a town or a city, you see similar places within a city that are important,
It's the,
and
it's
you
the
would regret greatly if they are lost.
it's the memory making, I think, is what you're saying. It's the making and the storing of memories, and you can't just simply pick that up and take it to another hill with a different view and a different outlook. It really is, I guess, about where the place has made an impact on the community. So, actually, on that point, engaging with communities, what sort of challenges do you face in that? I mean, if you were to have a public forum about a development, What sort of people show up and what sort of arguments are presented in those sorts of places, Roger, around preserving something?
Well, there are certainly the people that would say, "Well, I own this place. It's my right to do with it whatever I like." And you can say to people, "Okay, so you can afford to buy a Picasso. Does that mean you should be able to burn it?" And those people say, "Well, yes, of course, you own it. You've got every right to burn it." But in their hearts, I know they probably don't believe that.
Yeah.
So there is a community responsibility to look after the important places, whether people
In-
say it out loud or not.
And
It's still there.
and is there a need to do more with community engagement, or do you think the level that we put in at the moment is kind of about right?
No, there's always room for more engagement. And after the state government brought in its Heritage Act and a list of places to look after, the various local authorities followed suit. So you ended up with things of state significance and also things of local significance. I think Ipswich City Council was the first local authority to really pursue that, and they had such a wealth of heritage in Ipswich, and that perhaps could see what happened in Brisbane, where whole suburbs really got demolished for new development in the 60s and 70s. So yes,
Um, Ro-
every time a local authority puts out additions to its heritage list, they're really only as good as the ability to bring the community along with that. So
Roger,
I always like places.
Roger, in the day-to-day work that you do, I can imagine you do design work and you write briefs and you do reports and you study photos and you do all these sorts of things. What are the little stories or things that touch you and make you glad that you're doing this job? What are the sort of the highlight reels of the work you do on a day-to-day basis?
Well, one project I've been working on for really 30 years is looking after the lighthouses in Caloundra. Uh, the original lighthouse was built in 1896 when perhaps there were only a handful of houses in the town, and it served the maritime requirements for for many, many decades until a new concrete signal station was built. And about 3 years later, the powers that be said, right, the old lighthouse really needs to go. It should be demolished. And the local powerboat club and other groups in town thought that was a pretty bad idea. This was 1970. Heritage wasn't really on the top of people's minds. But the local powerboat club took it on themselves to relocate this building to Golden Beach, which was another local beach, to use as their clubhouse.
All
Now, of
right.
course, that didn't really pan out. It's a tiny little building, and they built a new clubhouse. So um, in the 1990s, it was pretty obvious that it wasn't going to survive. That the tie down had gone, people were breaking into it, water was leaking through the building, and it would only take a stray match and it would be gone. And being in the National Trust at the time, we spoke to head office and they said, "Oh, yes, we know about that lighthouse, but it's been moved and there's better examples in Queensland. There's a great one in Grassy Hill in Cooktown." And I'm thinking, well, that's all very good if you live in Cooktown, but what about Caloundra? Here's a place or a building that's really valued as part of the local community. And so we started a campaign to relocate the building back to its original site. The new 1968 signal station had or was in the process of being decommissioned at that time. It had lost the battle with the high rise on the ridge, and its view was being obstructed. So there was a real opportunity to relocate the building back to its original site, and that's something I campaigned for, and the possibility became a reality. Um, so that's a project now. Now it is back in its original site, and a few years later, we were able to nominate it for the Queensland Heritage List, and it was put on the list without a second thought. So it went from
Right.
being a not very important building to being of Queensland significance. And
That's great. So Roger, a couple of things I wanted to ask you. When we design new buildings, let's just take that frame of mind for a moment. Get presented with a whole heap of fire considerations and sustainability considerations and the ever-present commercial value considerations. When we come to do a project that's an extension or surrounding a heritage building, what what is your advice to either architects or engineers about how to have these concerns about fire and sustainability coexist with the need to preserve the heritage values of the site? What's your advice for making peace with these pushes and pulls on the design?
I think there's always a plan A and a plan B. And the plan B involves concern for the heritage significance of a place. And it's not always even considered. Places, people realise that it's not always possible to conserve places, but when you drill down, it usually is possible. But yes, if there's no feasible way of conserving a place, that's understood. But in my experience, there is always a way forward which conserves the heritage of the place. We had a building here in Caloundra that was a post-war building, and it was inhabited by a couple of Caloundra's surfing pioneers.
Oh yeah,
But not only that, it was a really quite a nice little building, but it was on a tricky triangular site, and it ended up being demolished. Whereas it could have quite easily have been converted to, say, a restaurant, and council would have been really happy to facilitate that, perhaps with some car parking concessions. But what happened was that the site remained undeveloped for more than a decade because it was virtually undevelopable. It was a small triangle, you couldn't get cars onto it, it needed an active street front, etc., etc. And as we speak, here's this place on a beautiful waterfront location in a commercial area, and it's being redeveloped as a house. Well, it could have been a restaurant for the last 10 years, earning the
mm,
owners profit, but it just got taken, costing them rate. So if they had have thought a bit more carefully about whether we demolish or not, I think they would have picked the non-demolish option and converted it for a commercial use. But they really shot themselves in the foot by thinking, oh, well, this building's just a bit of a nuisance. We'll just demolish it and worry about the rest later.
yeah, yeah. There's a famous quote that I think we hear in university, that is that you sustain the things that you love. Things that you love, you look after, and the buildings and the places that you love, you look after. So I guess that kind of helps us understand why heritage matters. I've worked for a couple of old British firms, that have you know come to Australia, and they often are a little bit derogatory about the extent of history and heritage in Australia. And I think This could be because they've had a bit to drink or something, but they'll often tease that Australia doesn't have heritage. You've only sort of 200 or 300 years, which brings the question about the role of Indigenous heritage in what you do and in what other people do. How much recognition or emphasis is there on the role of Indigenous architecture, heritage architecture?
Aboriginal people didn't build buildings as we think about buildings. They were nomadic. They moved around. It's perhaps a testament to the benign climate that we live in that you don't need buildings for survival. And I think they lived a good life. I I would rather be an Aboriginal person than perhaps being a child working in a cotton mill back in Liverpool.
Okay.
They they lived in an amazing place, which Europeans decimated virtually. Like here on the Sunshine Coast was the Great Bunya country. Um, but there are virtually none left here now. They all went into the walls and floors of the Queenslanders. But council won't plant bunya pines because they're a bit tricky to deal with. They drop large, weighty seed pods that can kill people. They have very spiky leaves, and so they just say, right, no bunya pines. Um, I'm interested in my local heritage, and the Indigenous heritage of this place is definitely part of that. Um, And I've actually been, collecting some of the stone from the indigenous stone around Caloundra, and the Cubby Cubby elders have said they're happy that I'm doing that, and that future generations might thank me if I label my samples well, but they're not interested. They see it as disturbed, which it is, and it's
Mm,
across Australia. Once you understand what you're looking at, you see stone everywhere. It doesn't degrade like timber objects, and here in Caloundra is sandstone country. So when they came in for the mullet migration, they brought stone with them, and it's still here, but it's
mm,
um, but it's unmentioned. It's when they were pushing it into the septic trenches in the 60s, whether they knew it was not local stone, I'm not sure. But
okay.
even today, council is happy to concrete over um, the stone. But
Mm,
that's going to be perhaps the heritage battle of the future. Um,
right. I guess in that I was mentioning those, English-born fellas that tease us. I think they come along with the view that there's, a story about Aborigines before the white people came along, and then there's, the story of the white people. There's very little conversation, pictures, illustrations, or knowledge about the period in between those two, when white men were
yes,
still
well,
guests in the country, and yeah.
Aboriginal people have been through a genocide, and they've been evicted from their traditional country. So their knowledge is probably fairly scant as well. They have their stories go back. I mean, I love here in Caloundra, we're in the or close to the Glasshouse Mountains, and they dominate our hinterland views. The Aboriginal story talks about a family of mountains and their activities, and how they're escaping the rising waters. Um, and of course, the waters were rising 6 to 10,000 years ago. They rose 150 metres at the end of the Ice Age. And
Hmm.
it's interesting that like in the Bible, those stories has have gone from word of mouth to written stories, but they all talk about that same event when the all the ice melted.
Hmm. Okay. All right. So let's get back to business. I think. What is a good day at the office for you, Roger? I mean, I'm meant to be talking about your role, and you had this little diversion into heritage architecture. What is a good day in the office, Roger? What are you really happy about when things happen?
Well, heritage is a game of time that you have to mount the same battles over and over again, whereas you only need to lose the battle once and you've lost the place. So a good day, I think, is when you and your client are on the same page and you're making suggestions to look after places which are implemented, that, that people appreciate what they've got. Um, in the world, if you own an old master, um, you value it and you look for the best advice to look after it. And I think when you find clients that have that same view about the place that they own, and that you can point them in the right direction and see them acting on that advice, that's very satisfying.
Okay, so
I think in
obviously the
architecture,
so obviously the inverse is also true that a bad day at the office is when your client's not on the same page and perhaps they're wanting to, I don't know, take something off the heritage list or get it delisted or something. Can I ask you though then what what are the other challenges? We've already talked about commercial pressure. We've talked about let's call it building design pressure. But what other challenges? We've talked a bit about education and wanting to make sure that people are aware of things. Are there other challenges in your role beyond what we've described here that make your job hard? And what could an engineer or an architect that's not normally involved in heritage, what could they do to lessen that, to minimise that challenge? Long-winded
well, I
question,
was
I
going to
know.
mention
So,
some of the challenges are natural challenges like floods and fire and cyclones, tornadoes.
hmm,
Uh, that's an important one. It's you don't conserve a building in one step. It's a lifetime, the lifetime of the building, um, and so when you're dealing with other consultants, you hope they've got a bit of understanding of what you're trying to do, and that they're happy to make some compromises in order to get a
to
heritage
preserve.
result. A
Hmm.
lot of it is just education about talking to people and explaining why places are important and how you deal with the specific areas of importance. The Heritage Act has about 8 criteria that they consider. Um, I have it written down here somewhere. Obviously, there's the historical reasons that a place is there, but they might be, for instance, the work of an important architect, or they might have specific importance for a community group, or they might display high technical achievement. It might be something like they had an important visitor to a site. It might be really nothing to do with the building that inhabits the site at the moment. So once you establish why a place is important, you've then got some um, direction about how to look after that importance. And it might not be about the beauty of the place, or it might be all about the beauty of the place. You might be looking after a particularly innovative septic system.
Right.
Could be quite different to if you were looking at a beautiful facade or the work of an important architect. So drilling down and finding out why a place is significant is fundamental in um, working out directions to conserve that significance.
So quite a lot of what you said today, Roger, sort of echoes to me or speaks to me that it's about finding out the story or the narrative of the place, and ensuring that that can be perpetuated. Why something came to be, what was the motivation for locating it here or building it of this size, and all those sorts of things. So, in the midst of, let's call it, the storytelling and the understanding of the story, what role does technology have? What sorts of technology would be necessary or are useful in the practice of heritage architecture and heritage preservation? Putting me on the spot
It's
here, I think.
interesting that when we looked at the history of the old lighthouse in Caloundra, it was pretty obvious that um, somebody said, "Oh, we think this is might be how they did it," and next thing it's in a book saying that's how they did it, and that becomes the history. And I think now we have a much better way of looking at history and recording history. One with the old lighthouse was the corrugated iron skin of the lighthouse, and it was actually because the building's a cone, the corrugation's taper as you run up the building. And the old story said they used special tapered rollers, and it was imported from Britain. And when you looked into it, you realised that could not possibly have been the case. Yeah. Yes, the stamp on the iron is Lights Art Queen's Head, which is the stamp for flat sheet. So you figure it came from Britain as flat sheet, and then was corrugated here. Um, but to use special tapered rollers is perhaps a little difficult because you'd need a different roller for every lift on the
Profile.
lighthouse, and it just
Mm.
kind of makes sense. Um, you were speaking about bad days at the office before, and when we did
Hmm.
finally get to move the lighthouse, when we lifted it on the crane, we dropped it, and
Oh,
that's
right.
a bad day at the office. Uh,
That
we
is
had
a
the
bad day.
engineer, the rigger, the builder, the architect, all standing around. And we said, "Take it away." Fortunately, we ticked the on hook insurance box before it was lifted, so we did have some recourse. But we did go through the process of having to remake that or some of that corrugated iron, and we enlisted the help of the Ripple Iron Curving Company, and they actually did it on a brake press, one corrugation at a time. And I
Right.
think that's probably how it was done back in the day. Um, but that was interesting that we had to actually develop a way of doing it ourselves to realise perhaps how they did it back in 1896.
We
Um,
have some, in engineering, we have some quaint sayings. One of them is to let sleeping dogs lie. In other words, don't touch it if you don't have to. And then a similar one is that if you're using a certain system, then you should just continue in the same principles and thinking of that system. Don't come along with a really modern way of doing air conditioning and attempt to sort of stick it all together. If the building was a naturally ventilated Queenslander, continue with that theme, for example. What other examples, Roger, spring to mind for a designer about staying in, let's call it the vibe of the building? What other stories or things come to mind for you about staying in with the theme of the building?
Well, I immediately think of some of the problem solving that, yes, it's very good to have natural ventilation, but in reality, you find your building sitting on or beside a four-lane road, and there's all this road noise and fumes coming through. So it's not always possible to continue in the same vein.
Mm.
But certainly, if you can, yes, you do. Um, and just going back to the technology question, I spoke about how how history was perhaps a little bit more um, carefully looked at, but we certainly use all the modern technology. I'm currently using point clouds, which are laser scans. It's not always easy to survey a heritage building, um, especially with a tape measure and a pad and paper. But the point clouds are amazingly accurate ways of recording what's there, and can another point cloud down the track will tell you whether something's moved 10 millimeters or not. Um, I've,
So,
I've, I've used 3D modeling since the 1990s, and that's a very powerful way of describing a building and getting a realistic view of the changes you might need to make to it. Um,
so when you're using point cloud, you're obviously generating like a 3D or a virtual reality image. Are there some exciting things about, almost generating holograms of what buildings used to look like or what these features used to look like? It feels like there's overlap here between what you're doing with buildings and what archaeologists are doing with their work.
Yes, it's very similar, where you very carefully look at parts of the building. Um, you might, um, you know, scrape scrape the paint to find out the succession of paint colours. Um, Archaeologists don't have the luxury, perhaps, of getting old photos of their archaeological sites, but you can
No.
certainly do that with buildings, and knowledge is power. The more you know, the better you can conserve what's important in a building. Often there's layers of successive building work that could be stripped back. Sometimes the successive layers are what's important, and you don't want to strip them back.
One of the final questions, Roger, I had is really about, are there things about the Australian heritage scene that are quite unique to Australia and therefore different to other countries? What sort of things are quite unique to Australia?
Well, I think I immediately think about the Queenslanders. They're unique to Queensland and maybe a bit of northern New South Wales, um, but they are similar to other vernacular architectures around the world. And without architects, but over thousands of years, you do get um, incredibly effective ways of dealing with um, different climates and conditions. I think of the mud buildings of the Middle East. and they're utilising a material that's in abundance. They don't have timber, but the earth has amazing um, ability to store heat. So in a desert environment where you get hot, dry
Freeze.
days and cold nights, if you've got a mud construction that can store heat for 12 hours, it's essentially heating up during the day and then cooling down at night. So it's taking the heat out of there.
Storing cools. Yeah, yeah.
Then you get little, for instance, you get a courtyard house, and in the courtyard, at the base of the courtyard, there's a pool of water. So you trap cold night air in the courtyard, and then the water through evaporative cooling keeps that air cool, and and the building feeds from that air, whereas the external walls have no windows and
Mm,
protect. So you have an amazing um, building for that climate, and then you go to the Arctic, and the Eskimos are building igloos. And as an engineer, you'd know that that dome it took a long time for the Romans to figure that one out, but the Eskimos have been using it all along.
mm,
And also, if you got your computer out and worked out um, you've got a really cold environment, you want to have as little external envelope as possible with the maximum internal envelope. And what that is that? Well, hey, it's a dome, isn't it?
it
And
is,
here's an
yeah.
incredibly shape which can survive a polar bear attack. Um, and they've used the only material they've got. I mean, the synchronicity is just amazing that they've
Mm,
developed this, and you see that throughout the world. You see the Pacific Islands where they build very lightweight constructions of bamboo and palm fronds and the like, and they are perfect for that tropical environment. That they don't hold heat. They can be strong. They keep the water out, and they're using materials that are abundant
abundant.
in that environment. And so the Queenslanders, we've touched on them before, but the early pioneers looked very carefully at how to build in this climate and this place. And
It must,
although the youngsters didn't come over generations and generations, they they're the closest thing Australia has to a vernacular architecture,
mm,
and they're a good response to the climate that we have here.
mm.
It's pretty amazing.
Well, Roger, thank you very much. You've given us 50 minutes, which is a terrific amount of time. I do thank you for that. I'm hoping that we launch this in around about 4 or 5 days' time, and you'll have an opportunity to review it and to tidy up something that might have been misinterpreted or something like that. But again, thank you, Roger, for your time. I'm hoping that my team and those who listen will take something away about the value of heritage architecture, the challenges that heritage architects face, what makes a good day, what makes a bad day. Don't drop the building. I think there's a lot of things that I'm hoping everyone benefits from listening into this session. So thank you, Roger, for your time.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Rebecca. I've enjoyed it.
All right, fantastic. I think in the next fortnight we're going to talk about fires in buildings and fire protection methods with a specialist who works in this area. So I'm looking forward to that, and I hope you guys can all join us at that time. Thanks again, and thanks again, Roger. Bye bye.
Thank you.